Mets, it's the Steve Cohen show. They're going to spend more. Lindor, they bring in May in the bullpen. They have a now healthy staff. Add Carrasco.
So the conversation with the Mets has to start with the money. This team is absolutely flush with cash now. And I don't think people realize the degree to which they have a financial advantage over every other team in this sport, not only this year, but going forward. Steve Cohen is comic book character rich. I'm talking richer than Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne's worth $10 billion. I'm talking richer than Bobby Axelrod, who's also worth about $9 to $10 billion.
By the way, Bobby Axelrod, that's if you watch the show Billions, that's basically what it's about.
We're talking Logan Roy territory, and that's Succession. That is a direct parody of Rupert Murdoch level rich. So the difference in wealth between Steve Cohen and the next richest owners in baseball, which is the Rogers Group in Toronto, that gap, which is about $6 billion, surpasses the total net worth of 27 of the 30 teams in baseball. In other words, Steve Cohen is twice as rich as 95% of the other owners in baseball. Now, the best analogy that I can come up with is when Sheikh Mansour bought Manchester City in 2008. If you'll allow me a little bit of a cross-sport comparison here. Manchester City was on a 40-year title drought when he took over the team. The Mets are on a 35-year title drought. He's now the richest owner in soccer and has been for quite some time, but he's the richest owner in the English Premier League by $8 billion, which is pretty comparable to the advantage that the Mets have over every other team. And they've won 5 titles in the past decade, or they're on their way to their 5th title in the past decade. Now, that's not only on-field investment, that's off-field investments, stadium, awareness of the organization itself being an improvement. We saw the reaction that players around the league had to Cohen's first press conference, willingness to come to New York and be with the Mets for the first time in a while. There's a feeling of change here in New York City with regards to which team has the control over potential luxurious and marquee free agents in the future. Obviously, do not think the Mets are done spending. If they're willing to go out and acquire players like Chris Bryant or Eugenio Suarez, potentially move JD Davis around the diamond, make him more of a platoon against lefties, whatever they need to do, this team is willing to add. I don't think if they have any sort of desire to sign Francisco Lindor, that they're not going to get that done. It's more a matter of, do they want to lock him up long term? This team has the money to make all of the financial moves that they want to make. It's just about making the right baseball decisions now. I said on this podcast last year that if and when Steve Cohen took over the team, his first move would be to fire Brodie Van Wagenen on day one. It's exactly what he did. The man had so many more liabilities than assets that he added to the roster. They're just back to making smart, sound baseball decisions now, adding to the team. And frankly, the prospects that they have in place who have come up at the same time that they're also adding to the team just puts this in position to, make the Mets an immediate contender and certainly put them in position to compete with the Braves in the NL East right away. So I have the Mets winning their division 49% of the time this year. And as we talked about with the Astros last week, I am the conservative person in the projection market. Fangraphs, they're at 54%, and Pacoda's all the way up at 70% because they're a little bit down on the Braves. Pacoda, they admitted to having a bit of a difficulty with projecting the Braves. It might have something to do with their home ballpark. They've been low on the Braves the past couple of years. They have them down at, I believe,
70%. They're at. They're because it's 70% for the Mets.
They're at 70% for the Mets in the NL East, and again, I'm at 49%. So even if you take my projection and you're just working off of that, there's value on this team down to about plus 125 at a 5% edge. You can still get them at plus 170 at BetMGM. So that's an absurd number. I think that's absolutely worth playing, just in the same way that the Astros plus 160 is worth hitting. It's probably the best number on a team that is likely to win their division. I believe Eno Saris, who's high on the Astros and Mets as well, just because the quality of stuff that these two teams have in their rotation. So when you look at the Mets from top to bottom, the only concern I really have is defense. They've been a poor defensive club for a few years. They don't really have the players on the roster to fix those holes immediately. They still have to stick Dominic Smith in left field, who should outshine his defensive weaknesses with his bat. Had an OPS over 1,000 last year. Looks like a potential guy to continue to break out this year. But man, really relative to the rest of the division, the value here is all on the Mets for me. I have their win projected at 94 and a half. The rest of the market's at 93, 91 and a half, and 94.2. So you can get them at over 89 and a half wins. You can get them over 90 and a half wins. I like both of those numbers. And like I said, I like their divisional odds too, down to about plus 125.
My questions for you about the Mets were, because of their signings and how they're able to platoon, you're no longer worried about them against lefties, which is a concern that I had before any of the offseason moves. I was going to ask you about the defense, and do you now think that the bullpen is a strength?
So like JD Davis murders lefties. Having Lindor and Jonathan VR in there as switch hitters, I think certainly opens things up, allows them to platoon a little bit more. Bullpen has obvious concerns, just because Edwin Diaz is so enigmatic. Dylan Betances didn't look 100% healthy last year, but I really like the Trevor May signing. I thought that was very underrated. He's been a really effective reliever for a few years. So yeah, I mean, I think they're so much deeper than they were headed into last year. They're not filling out the bottom end of the rotation with guys like Michael Wacha, who I think actually could be much better this year than he looked last year with the Rays. There's just good strikeout to walk numbers that indicate he can take a step back forward, but they really just did such a better job from a front office perspective of filling this team out with depth and not just going stars and scrubs like Brody had kind of built them to be in the past few years. And like I mentioned, they can continue to solidify this team throughout the year as they go. They're far from done spending. I think they're just kind of in a wait and see approach in terms of what pieces they need, and rather than just splurging money for the purposes of splurging money. They would have been happy to add Bauer, but why allocate that money elsewhere until you need to?
Yeah, I think the scariest part about the Mets is if things don't fall apart as they have for the Mets in recent past, sometimes due to injuries or whatever it may be, and they get into the playoffs and their staff is healthy, that's where they're going to be the scariest.
Colin, Carlos Carrasco came over in the trade with Lindor, I think was the most surprising thing to me. I mean, it just added another all-star caliber pitcher to that rotation. It took away the need for them to sign a free agent.
Yep. Colin, let me bring you in here. Are you going to share in Cirillo's enthusiasm for the Mets here? What do you got?
Well, I have a bet that includes the Mets, but it's not exactly on the division. So I think what I'll do is I'll start from the bottom of the NL East.
Teoscar Hernandez, more RBIs than the Mets, plus $4 million for the year.
If he was traded to the Mets would win the World Series. The bet to make, besides the Mets division, which I completely agree with, all the way down to plus 120. And let's talk about that. This is being recorded at the end of February. You may be listening to this at the end of March because you're just now getting around to baseball and college basketball is over and there's just a dead period in sports. I think that Mets number is gone. That 170, 150, 140. I think by the time everybody's got their eyes on baseball, the Mets, by God, may be minus 140 to win the division. So I think plus 120. Cirillo may have a different number. I think plus 120 is the place to stop buying. If he's got it at 49%, then definitely minus 110 is a no-go territory. I think the one thing I'm going to end on is a prop, and a prop is the hitting prop. Lindor, I was thinking about Lindor and park factors going from Progressive to City. Does it affect his home runs a little bit? Generally, City Field is lower than Progressive in home runs, but that's not really what I'm looking at. Really, if you look at his hits and his plate appearances, he's supposed to have 700 plate appearances per Zips, which is more than anybody else in Major League Baseball. Raphael Devers for the Red Sox expected to have 25 less plate appearances. And then he's projected to finish top 5 in hits, but he's listed at 20-1 at DK for most hits, while Devers, who's projected to have the most hits by Zips, is 22-1 for hits. So, most hits on the season, Devers at 22-1, Lindor at 20-1. This is who Zips projects to have the most plate appearances and the most hits on the season. I think those are worth betting.
I agree on the Mets. Mets plus 120, plus 130. I agree on. I can stamp that a consensus, even though, excuse my French, fuck the Mets, go Phillies. But this is a podcast about making money first. So I could stamp my approval on that. Any rebuttal to anything Colin said, Cirillo?
No, I should add, I lauded the Mets for being the richest organization in baseball. The Braves are third. So it's not like the Braves can't spend money. It's not like the Braves haven't been spending money. Obviously, Acuna, one of the best players in the game. Ian Anderson popped off the screen last year, right in the playoffs with how dominant that guy was. So, Yeah, I think, like you said, if these teams both perform to their peak, it's going to be a very close and fun divisional race down the stretch. But I think the Mets do get the slight edge for the ability to fill a little bit more holes as we go here, and just in terms of overall upside with that core of players that they have. I think people are really overlooking Dom Smith, and that entire Mets lineup from top to bottom could just absolutely rake. Pete Alonso kind of underachieved last year just with where his fly balls landed relative to his batted ball, velocity, exit velocity, and barrels. So there's just an enormous upside for this Mets team to overachieve. I think, we talked a little bit about ceilings and floors last week. I think paying for the Mets over 89.5 wins, you're almost paying for their floor with about 10 wins of upside there. If this team finishes with fewer than 86 wins, it's going to be a massive disappointment.
Yeah, I actually think that the difference, look, I mean, you have, Ian Anderson been brought up the right way, and everything that I saw last year screams that nothing about him is a fluke. And then you have Fried, obviously, like two great rotations if everything works out, two great lineups. I think the difference actually might be the Mets bullpen. It's shocking to say that just because of the history of the Mets bullpen, but I think that's where they actually could end up winning the division. But I completely agree with you.